That's it for French. Okay, so Saints to Sociopaths, in case we have any saints in the audience, and dopamine. So dopamine is probably something you've heard of, and hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll know a lot more about it, and especially its implications on behavior. But beforehand, I think I'm feeling thirsty. So, guess what that was? That was dopamine in my brain. And I just consumed a soda, and I like soda, it's my favorite, it's orange soda. And so I saw the soda, I drank it, and all throughout, my dopamine neurons were saying, thank you, I really like the soda. You just make me feel real good. And so basically, that's dopamine, right? Dopamine actually is, all right, I feel good. But dopamine isn't just I feel good. Dopamine is, I want this because it feels good. So how is that? Well, so this is a brain, right? This is a picture of a brain. And by the way, we're in the era of the connectome. Obama administration just passed a legislature that actually emphasizes the importance of looking at brain connections. Now, you probably know that the brain is made of these cells called neurons. And these neurons are actually very, very elaborate. They talk to each other. They talk to each other through chemicals, but they talk to each other through electrical impulses. And so the goal of neuroscience today is to be able to take this knowledge and translate it into something much bigger. How does a human being behave based on this? And ultimately to understand why in some cases you have abnormalities in behavior and diseases. So let me give you a number. So there's about 100 trillion synapses in the adult brain. That's a lot. And packed into a 3-pound structure, those synapses are thought to be the cause of how you behave. They're always active. Even when you're not active and when you're sleeping, they're actually active. They're always firing. And their firing is actually dictating an internal state that we are only partially aware of. We're actually only a little bit aware of what's going on in our brain at any point in time. So that's actually kind of really profound. And so one of the things that's really been interesting is to try to understand how specific chemicals work. So the past 100 years have really been a race to understand how molecules assemble and work in cells, and we're nowhere near actually understanding it. But one chemical has really sort of taken the stage for bridging knowledge between basic chemical transmission and behavior, and that's dopamine. I would say that the last 50 years have really belonged to dopamine. A Nobel Prize was given in 2000 to 3 scientists who studied dopamine. So dopamine is this molecule. It's actually one of many, many molecules, and by no means is the message that you go home and think that dopamine is everything. Dopamine is just a story, and this story is that, well, we can understand behavior through one message, through one molecule. So now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's actually not only in humans. It's made in many, many animals. Primates have it, and most of the research on dopamine and decision-making has been in primates, looking at how reward decisions are made and complex decisions are made through dopamine. But not only do not only do primates have dopamine, animals do. Cats, dogs, and many mammals do. And most of the circuits that actually drive dopamine in decision-making in humans are present and intact and responsible for learning in animals. And actually, even far down the evolutionary tree, invertebrates like Drosophila have dopamine. And they utilize dopamine as well to learn. So somewhere along evolution, this chemical became a primary trigger for understanding pleasure, things to move towards, and ultimately in humans, the chemical that drives us to do things. All right, so what's interesting about this is that I told you there's about 100 trillion synapses. Well, the number of dopamine cells in your brain is actually small. Only 1% of all neurons in your brain produce dopamine. And yet its effect is so powerful that psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, ADHD, and drug addiction are all highly implicated in dopamine. Much of what actually drives us is dopamine signaling through those 1% small population of neurons located pretty far inside your brain. So, all right, so we know that dopamine is linked to reward. The higher the dopamine is in your brain, the more likely that you feel good, and the more likely that you're wanting to perform a certain behavior. Well, so we also know that dopamine is linked to rewards of natural abundance. So for example, food, a natural reward, elevates dopamine. For most people, not only eating, but the sight of food actually elevates dopamine. Dopamine is also high in drinking and in alcohol. For most people, drinking is actually a pleasurable activity, and so dopamine in many instances alcohol elevates dopamine, and by elevating it, it is thought that this may be a mechanism by which addiction takes place. And then of course, dopamine also goes up in sex, and actually not only during sex, but the drive for sex is very much paired to dopamine. The mating game is actually all about dopamine. Dopamine is very high in play, adult play as well as children play. And dopamine increasingly seems to be associated with this big addiction that's going on right now, that's internet addiction. Whether it's Facebook addiction or email addiction, it's been actually shown that dopamine spikes up in the brains of participants when they see a new message in their inbox. It feels good, levels of dopamine go up. So dopamine is paired to so many things, natural rewards and rewards that are actually synthetic and present in society. Now the most interesting thing about dopamine is that it actually isn't itself the chemical that translates into, this feels good. This is a misconception about dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical that goes up when you think this feels good, right? And it actually, in many cases, it goes up before the feel good. The feel good comes from endorphins. That's something else altogether, another talk. The feel good comes from a level of endorphins going up, but dopamine goes up before. Dopamine actually goes up even before you acquire something that feels good if you think you're going to acquire it. And the more you think you're going to acquire it, the higher the dopamine. So the interesting thing about this is dopamine apparently is very linked to what drives us. And we know that in today's society, what drives us very much relates to money. And so there's a lot of neuroeconomics being studied in terms of how dopamine regulates decisions. And money is actually beautiful because money is a proxy for what feels good. Nobody actually really enjoys the taste or smell of money. What actually feels good about money, even if it is the smell of it, is what money is going to give you, right? And so dopamine goes up with money. And that's actually been very interesting for many economists. Well, so we know that we're driven by dopamine. We work many hours, right? Because we want to actually make money, and it is thought that that dopamine makes us work many hours. We get up every day, we put on our clothes, and we go to work, or we do our 5 a.m. run, or we do whatever it is. Basically, we're being driven by all these incentives that we believe are going to be good for us, and they're going to feel good. Even though we don't feel good while we're doing them, we're being driven to do them. And we're being driven by dopamine signaling in our brain. Now, interestingly, so when we actually make the money, right, and we get it, we spend it. And the Americans are actually the best at this. I think America is a wonderful experiment in dopamine. We not only actually work hard to make money, but we actually spend it so well, right? And that too, by the way, increases our dopamine. Dopamine goes up when you spend money. So wonderful. So we buy things that we think are going to make us feel good, and so we spend the money, right? What did we spend it on? Well, we spend it on food. That also elevates our dopamine, right? And we spend it on drugs in many instances, alcohol and other illicit drugs. So this is great. So we actually get up, right? We have a dopamine boost to actually make money. We make the money and then we use it on things that boost dopamine. We have a dopamine problem. We actually not only have a dopamine problem, we actually have a problem in which so much of our natural rewards are far away from what give us pleasure. Most of us are actually quite a bit disassociated from natural pleasure. We're working in cycles of dopamine that are all about perceived pleasure, the anticipation of pleasure, right? And so this is actually really interesting. Because how did we get here, right? How is it that we actually got to be a society and individuals that are so driven, so hard for things that we think are rewarding, and yet we're sort of, in many cases, unhappy, right? Well, so let's take an example from a great American icon. You may have seen him. His name is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson is actually very driven by food. He loves food. But he's not a very cultured guy. He's sort of a regular guy, grew up in a small town called Springfield somewhere in the US, right? And he doesn't necessarily come from a lot of money. Well, Homer Simpson actually grew to love music, in particular Mozart. He's crazy about Mozart. So let's go into Homer Simpson's brain. And let's think about how this may have happened. How did Homer Simpson, growing up in Springfield, maybe Virginia, right? But basically grow up to actually love Mozart. So here's Homer Simpson. Let's say he's a kid, right? Let's say he's about 6 years old. Normal kid, goes to school, plays around. His parents take him to a cafe to eat a donut. The cafe happens to be called Cafe Mozart. And Cafe Mozart plays Mozart, right? And it's playing all the time. And there he is, 6-year-old Homer Simpson, eating his donut, totally loving it and listening to Mozart, not noticing it. Well, as he grew up and became a teenager, got his first job, he still loved donuts, but now he could afford them, right? So he goes to Cafe Mozart a lot, and he eats a lot of donuts, right? And he's still listening, they're still playing Mozart. All right, fast forward, he has now got a family, he's in his 40s, just went to the doctor, was told, you gotta stop on those donuts. They're not good for you. All right, so he says, fine. So what does Homer Simpson do to give himself pleasure? He exercises to Mozart, right? He still loves Mozart. It sort of somehow reminds him of his donuts. Maybe he's not even realizing it. So he exercises to Mozart. He gets up every morning and exercises. His dopamine levels go up just as much. Actually, as a matter of fact, his dopamine levels go up even more in the presence of Mozart. Mozart has come to actually symbolize the pleasure that he is seeking, and the pleasure that probably as a kid he acquired in youth. All right, so too much dopamine, is it a problem? Well, if you utilize it for the best, wonderful, you could do all sorts of things, right? If your drive is actually focused, but let's say your drive is actually not focused, or let's say there's actually a lot of dopamine in your circuit, maybe through genetics, right? Turns out that genetics is important. All right, so, well, we know that for addiction, and addiction in particular, that high level of dopamine is what facilitates almost all drugs of abuse, right? So regardless of whether you're addicted to alcohol, heroin, marijuana, pot, less addictive, but pot, right? Or even the internet, all of those things are addictive because they spike the dopamine in your brain. So that has become very established. So the higher the dopamine, the higher the addictive potential. So the most addictive substance on this planet is cocaine. One-time cocaine can actually hook some people. Cocaine acts directly on the dopamine transporter. Now here's actually an image. This is actually what they call a PET image, which is an image to look at the dopamine receptor availability in the brain. And what you can see here are the brains of individuals who are non-addicts and individuals who are addicted to different things, cocaine addicts, meth addicts, alcohol, and heroin addicts. And this is looking at the occupancy of the primary dopamine receptor, the primary molecule that responds to dopamine in the striatum. And what you can see across the board is that there is a diminished dopamine receptor signal regardless of the addiction. This is actually consistent. All drugs of abuse increase dopamine levels and decrease dopamine receptor density in the striatum. Interestingly, other addictions are also impacted. Overeating and addiction to food can also diminish dopamine receptors almost to the same extent as cocaine, right? So now we start talking about, okay, well maybe we're not just talking about drugs of abuse here. We're talking about lifestyles. We're talking about habits. We're talking about doing things and treating them like addictions. Well, it turns out that when your dopamine levels go up as well, you're more likely to take risk. You're more likely to be impulsive. You're more likely to do something that you shouldn't do, possibly send an email maybe that you shouldn't be sending before reading it for one more time. So dopamine, high levels of dopamine are associated with risk-taking. It turns out that in a genetic study, a polymorphism, which is a single change in one of the amino acids of the dopamine receptor, makes some people very, very much likely to seek novelty-seeking behavior. These are the people that will jump out of airplanes or do bungee jumping and this is actually a mutation in the dopamine receptor gene. Well, attention deficit disorder, high dopamine levels make you also less likely to focus. And so, interestingly, the main treatment for ADHD in children is a drug that works on the dopamine system, right? Ritalin, methylphenidate. It's actually a drug that regulates dopamine levels in the brains of children and makes them more focused. So you see the link, pleasure, reward, I want it, right? Impulsive behavior, and now I can't focus. And then lastly, violence. The extreme end of high dopamine is violent behavior. Violent behavior that seems to actually come from a very strong dopamine drive. All right, so I'm going to tell you about a study that actually started about 10 years ago. And this study was actually looking at a population, a tribe population of Maorists in New Zealand. So this is an indigenous group in the Polynesian islands, and they have lived under very harsh circumstances and harsh environments. This particular population is prone to addiction, they're prone to violence, and they actually also happen to not incorporate and assimilate very well into New Zealand society. So about 10 years ago, a sociologist went and did a study, and he found that these individuals carried a specific change, a mutation, in monoamine oxidase, the primary enzyme in the brain that actually breaks down dopamine. In this population, about 60% of the men, not the women, but 60% of the men carried a low-functioning monoamine oxidase. So the levels of dopamine in their brain were higher. Now, interestingly, this became dubbed as the warrior gene. So now actually, if you get online and you look a little bit, there's a lot of research because it's opened up a new path at looking at the genetics of violence. It turns out that this gene is different across different populations and very high in prison inmates, especially in men. So this warrior gene regulates dopamine level and regulates that dopamine drive, right? But in this case, with men, makes them more violent. Now, interestingly, this gene is carried by mothers and passed on to sons. So, in many cases, the women carrying the gene don't exhibit the same level of violence, and they pass it on to the children. The way this works is basically it's an X-linked gene, and so it is on the mothers, and the mother happens to have two X's, as women do, and so she passes on the X to the son, because the son will only get an X from the mom, and he gets a Y from the dad. And so basically, one of her sons, if she has plenty of sons, is also at a high risk of getting this gene. Now, the phenotype, the behavior of the son, is usually very violent. In many cases, these are individuals that are prone to actually end up in prison or in trouble. And this has actually been repeated in terms of confirming the data, that there's actually a link between people who end up in prison and people who carry this gene. So interesting, from an evolutionary perspective, maybe this gene actually has been preserved and was really important for a function. So if we go back to our not so long ancestry, maybe our relatives actually required this group of men, which by the way is about 30% in Caucasians, a little higher in African Americans, and about 20% in Asians, okay? And then there's the numbers go on and on, okay? So maybe actually you needed that percentage of the population, those men, to go out there and fight the lion and defend us. In today's world, this gene appears to actually confer a certain level of violence that seems to be problematic in society. So some behaviors that emerge are sociopaths, tend to be actually carriers of this gene, and I already told you people who end up in prison. So this actually presents another problem, and this has been actually now researched in young children. So how is it then that we can now test children, find out that they have this gene, and can we actually help them? So a study was published last year in Lancet. This study actually was of a group of 20,000 young boys, the ages of 7 to 14. And the authors actually looked at those boys and looked at them in deprived socioeconomic environments. And he actually followed them, so it was a longitudinal study. And what he found was a significant portion of them carried the gene. As I told you, it's about 30 to 40% in the general population. And of the carriers of this gene, of the MAO gene, about 80% ended up in prison, okay? Now, interestingly, he looked at that population a little more carefully, and he broke it down into two groups. Those that ended up in prison because maybe they sold drugs or broke into cars, versus those that ended up in prison because of more violent crimes, like gun crimes. And what it turns out is, of the carriers of the gene, what really determined whether they were going to be the kind of people that commit violent crimes versus the kind of people that actually commit non-violent crimes was the home environment. So for those individuals who carried the gene and had a home environment in which at least one parental figure was present, and that parental figure or mentor or guardian was attentive, they were less likely to commit a violent crime. Okay? So thinking about this, what it does mean is that genetics is part of the story. There is a genetics that seems to be involved in regulating an individual's tendency to do something, but these genetics in themselves are not deterministic. They actually involve environmental factors. All right, that's it.